from across the globe, from the centre of aerospace. And now to you.
Thank you for downloading the Aero Society podcast from the Royal Aeronautical Society.
Good evening. Good. Can everyone hear me? Good. I don't know if you noticed as you came in, that was the global air traffic over a 24-hour period moving. It just kind of gives you an idea of the scale of aviation in the globe. I'm going to start off with Grenville. Everyone obviously knows about this very tragic fire last year on the 14th of June. Well, a month afterwards, the CAA did its own review on Grenville. We used the information that was available on the internet and did our own mini investigation. We obviously didn't talk to anybody or anybody else. It was just an internal review. And we were focusing on, is there anything we could learn from the Grenville tragedy in aviation? And we were surprised with the outcome. So I'm going to just leave you hanging there on that one, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. So I'm going to just skip back. My name is Troy Preston. I am Head of Future Safety at the Civil Aviation Authority. I've been there 7.5 years now, and I've done a number of jobs. For those of you that might have been expecting a gentleman called Porrick Kelleher, he was going to be doing this lecture, but he got promoted in between, and he's now in ICAO in Montreal, and is the UK representative there. So we wish him well over there. And the good thing is, in my new role, I will be interfacing with him quite a lot anyway. So just a little bit about my department, the Future Safety. It's quite a jazzy name. It kind of describes a number of departments that I oversee. We do the CA safety strategy. And within that, there's things like the safety management and human performance. Also a department of policy experts, and that covers all the capability areas. We have some technical support that supports some other teams within the CAA. I also have a business assurance team. So this is overseeing the plan that we want to do over the next 5 years and over the next year, and making sure that we do it. And I have a safety assurance team. So that's our internal review team that looks at specifically safety and internally looking. And they are the guys that undertook the safety review on Grenville. Okay, so I'm just going to skip back into the past and give us a little bit of history of how the CAA came about and its journey. So back in 1910, Charles Rolls, a keen aviator and co-founder of Rolls-Royce, he was one of the victims of air accidents. For that year, there were 30 pilots and 2 passengers that unfortunately died while flying. That prompted a whole series of events that we wanted to learn from aviation, and we wanted to encourage more aviation. So things like we wanted to share best practice. We wanted to come up with a set of rules, and it was only as a result of investigating this that I found out the first rules of the air were created based on the rules of playing polo, which is quite amazing, isn't it? Okay, so then in 1937, to help the aviation industry evolve and making sure that we are as safe as we could be, the Air Registration Board was formed in 1937, and Dr. Harold Roxby Cox led that team. In 1972, we formed the CAA as we know it today. And that was formed from a number of departments that had formed before then, including the ARB, to create the CAA. And there's just a few events in here that I'd like to highlight to you to indicate the journey that we've been on, some important points. The first one was in 1976, a mandatory scheme of reporting of accidents and incidents was brought in. And it wasn't until we started to look at Grenville that we realised what a gift this is that we've got in place, because the building industry does not have the same thing here. So what we have in place is where any incident or accident happens, there is a requirement, a mandatory requirement to report that, and that all comes in centrally. Then in 1979, we started to adopt the European rules as were formed from the European Agency for Safety, the EASA. Then a key significant development in 2011 was the introduction in the ICAO, and that's the International Civil Aviation Organization. So that's the organization that was formed in 1944 and covers the rules for the globe on aviation. And Annex 19 was put in place that covered safety management. And this is absolutely fundamental to how we work today. So this requires organizations to have a safety management system in place where they have ownership of their own safety and make calls and judgment calls on that safety. Up until this point, the Civil Aviation Authority was predominantly checking compliance against regulations and rules. But we realised that we couldn't just work like that. We had to be focusing on where the risks were. So our performance-based regulation that started in 2013, and I would say we haven't finished this yet, but we have come leaps and bounds and are now seen as some forerunners in this approach of regulation. This is where we focus on risk, but also compliance is still very important, so we merge the two together, risk and compliance. Then in 2015, I mentioned earlier that Annex 19 required each company or organisation to have safety management systems in place. We applied that to ourselves, but it was a slight difference in approach. We now have a picture of all the risks that we think are important for UK aviation, and we monitor the mitigations for those risks and encourage, influence, etc., organisations to do actions that mitigate those risks. Because an organisation has visibility of their own safety, their own risks, but they don't have visibility of others in the same sector or other sectors. We do, and what we can do is see that there are a number of companies maybe with the same risk that we should be implementing some mitigation across that whole sector. So we have unique insights into that, and we try to influence to get that mitigated.
Oh, excuse me. No, I didn't catch what PB asked for.
Performance-based regulation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And now we're into trying to predict where risks will be. And the key word you'll hear all the way through this is learning, because that, for me, is the key. It's the key from where we've been, and it's the key to where we're going. Okay, just to describe a little bit of what we cover. So basically, if you fly a plane, if you have a plane, if you operate a plane, if you operate an airport or go through airspace, or you're the pilot themselves, we will oversee you. So we require you to enter our system and to be assessed and validated to do that task. There's quite a wide range of activity that we do. Okay, this is just a quick glimpse of safety and how it has evolved over the years. This is a 50-fold improvement over the last, 50 years, whatever. And that doesn't happen by accident. So what I'd like to talk to you about now is how many fatalities do you think we had on commercial air transport last year? Anyone have a guess?
0.
0, correct. Now, just to compare that with other forms of transport, I was talking to somebody earlier about maybe a nervousness that they have about flying, but when you compare it against some of these other forms of transport, and the surprise one in there is walking, as far as I'm concerned. That's so you're better off on a plane than you are walking. It just kind of puts it in perspective, and again, that doesn't happen by accident. So, here's my view of what I think makes us safe. How did we get to that 50-fold improvement in safety? 3 themes here. There's the individual human and their aircraft, the industry, and the overarching system. 10 factors that are driving safety. So number 1, competency. So we have requirements that pilots, engineers, air traffic controllers all have to be trained, and that training has to be approved. They have to go through simulations. They're continuously assessed, so they go through continuation training. They have to go through exams, and they have to be licensed for any new variants of aircraft or equipment that they're working on. So quite a high level of standard that the human has to go through to be a part of this aviation system. And there is, unlike, for example, the building trade that I mentioned earlier in Grenville, there is an intrinsic involvement of the individuals that are on, that are flying that plane or a cabin in that plane. That it's in their interest to report issues, to alert their company and the Civil Aviation Authority of issues that they have. And they don't hold back, which is great, because then we get to understand emerging trends. And they're not afraid to challenge each other and say, well, why are you doing that? We had an example quite a few years ago now, the Uberlingen head-on mid-air collision, where there was, if they'd have done a bit of challenging and teamwork in, that may never have happened. Okay, third factor is airworthiness. So the aircraft and the systems on that aircraft have to go through a robust, similar to the human, have to go through robust testing and approval before they're allowed to fly. We have ongoing oversight of the manufacturing and the maintenance of that equipment. And what's great is that equipment adopts the latest and newest technology as well. So there's a lot of advancements that you see on these aircrafts that are in use. And sometimes it's us that's holding that back because we've not seen enough safety assurance associated with that. Our fourth one is about just culture, and I mentioned this earlier. It's about the safety reporting that we've got in place. Now, a lot of these, although it's mandatory, Obviously, there's also some areas that are voluntary, so they have to report on that thing, but people also report on other things. So we have 30,000, above 30,000, I think last year it was about 32,000 reports a year that we get in where people are concerned about something. Not to say there's a major issue, but it helps us understand where our attention needs to be. Also, we have a confidential reporting or a whistleblowing process. Obviously, things have gone wrong if that's needed, because we encourage companies to have their internal reporting and for them to learn. But if everything goes wrong or then don't feel they're being listened to, they can report to us, and then we will confidentially and sensitively investigate that. Sometimes we have to be really clever about how we do that, because we don't want it kind of going back to that individual. So we have to do it as a kind of, we're just here to do an audit and we look at a few things and then we home in on the thing that has been reported. So as a result of all this reporting, we have a whole load of data, and the industry also has a hunger for data. The amount of data that's downloaded from each aircraft on a daily basis is huge. I mean, beyond my understanding. But when you think of it's nearly 33,000 last year reported occurrences, we then are monitoring that and analysing that for potentially new safety issues. And that feeds back into our regulatory safety management system that I mentioned earlier, because that's potentially a new risk that we have found there. And the whole idea about this is actually we're finding problems before they've gone serious. So that's our aim in life, that we actually are preventing accidents or incidents happening. So then we move on to the industry itself. That's a key factor. So the aviation industry is growing hugely. If you see the graphs of expansion, I've got one a bit later on, it's growing at a huge rate. And the safety standards have to match that, because with current rates, the accident rate would be unacceptable to the public and to the aviation world in general. So we have to make sure we're continuously improving and learning from all the information that we've got to drive those safety improvements into the system. Because it wouldn't take long for confidence to be lost if there was a major accident every week. And there is a real positive link between business and safety, because companies don't last long if they have major accidents. So it's in their interest and it is their business to be as safe as possible. I've entered into conversations many a time about would we publish safety data about a particular company? And actually, the safety levels of these companies is so high, they don't even get approval unless they are so high. So when we're talking about 99% safety, there is no point publishing that data. What we want is for them to be learning and improving continuously. Because if we said that one was safer than another, then it wouldn't drive the right behaviours. What we're trying to do is get them to report all the time and to act on what they find. So we are lucky that we do have a global system. We have the ICAO regulations, and within Europe we have the EASA regulations. That drives consistency across the patch. Within EASA, they do standardization audits of different countries. They involve various countries doing an audit on another country. We have them continuously. And it just makes sure that standards are being maintained and forces that any incompetence in the system is ruled out. Also, it encourages that driving of the safety culture, assuring what you're doing is correct. We have robust investigation process. We have an independent investigation branch within the UK, and most countries have them. It's the AAIB, the Air Accident Investigation Board, that investigate an accident if it does happen and provides independent assessment of that feeds back into the industry and to us. That's really valuable, and our connections with that, because they do some learning all the time that we want to learn, and because we can act quicker than their reports, so we can feed that back into the system quickly. Okay, my last factor here is that it's all about our approach as well. If we are focused on what the top risks are, and when we do go out and do our audits, we are focusing on those risks. We hold individual companies. We have a thing called an accountable manager, so that's the person we would talk to given any safety issues, or would be our interface for any audit. They have to be of a level where they can make a difference, so they generally are directors of operation or CEOs, and we would feed back to them any findings that we have from our audits of them. But we're really clear the accountability rests with them, and although we have the ability to take away their approvals, it never normally gets to that unless it's fairly serious. We expect them to be looking at their data all the time, looking for trends, any design faults, any human factors, training, etc. that they're missing. And as I mentioned earlier, we have this independent investigation branch that happens across the globe. So most countries have investigators, and they talk to each other as well and interface. So if we have UK passengers involved in an accident abroad, then our UK investigation team would probably go and join the investigation team. So what does the future hold? Well, I mentioned earlier about traffic growth. So here's an IATA prediction, and even the most pessimistic case there, it's showing quite an improvement, an expansion of air traffic. That's a challenge. As I mentioned earlier, if we keep with the same rates of safety accidents, the numbers of safety accidents would go up quite considerably, which is why we continuously have to drive improvement into the system on a global basis. We have some new challenges. We have globalization, so we have companies taking over other international companies, and they're having to work in a number of countries. We're seeing some variation in that at the moment, where people are putting their headquarters is changing continuously. And we've got new low carrier potential business models emerging continuously. We have new technologies that are just about to, we're starting to see emerge. We see drones, we see the Virgin Atlantic work, and we're starting to see the idea about passenger drones as well. So how are we adapting to this? So what are we doing to cope with this challenging but exciting future? So I mentioned earlier about the safety management systems. That is absolutely key, that we continue to drive the company's uptake on safety management systems, making sure that they are making that as effective as they can be, challenging them if they're not, and also encouraging training for that. We're so keen on that we do some training on this ourselves. We're also implemented, as I mentioned earlier, the regulatory safety management system. So that is a hierarchy of meetings that we have now where flight operations, airworthiness, future safety, we all have our safety focus meetings where we're talking about the risks in our area and what we're doing about it, driving the actions forward. And then that all comes together and we have the overview of all of those sectors, and my boss is challenging us to make sure that we're doing enough. And then his boss in a governance meeting above that is challenging all of us that we're doing enough. And that is all about, though, we have the ability to influence. So we very rarely are doing the actions ourselves. We are trying to encourage other people to do it, whether that be DFT, it could be other national authorities abroad, it could be the airlines themselves or training industry, etc. So we're trying to influence them to either focus on something or change something. So performance-based regulation, I think somebody asked me what that stood for a little bit earlier. So this is kind of like a simplified view of what that is. So one of the things now, so for example, flight operations. So we have a number of airlines in that group that are overseen by that group. And what we do is we put these airlines in one of these categories, either highly complex, quite complex, or less complex. We put those into that, what we call a hazard triangle, complexity triangle. And that kind of starts to help us understand how much time we should be spending or focusing on that company. And then we get all of our internal people together that are focused on that company. And we say, and we have a discussion about that company, whether they be a discussion about how effective their safety management system is, how quick they are at closing the observations that and findings that we make, what we think of the safety culture within that company. And what happens is we have different views on the same company that are all feeding in, that are creating that picture, that then we would then go out and talk to the accountable manager that I mentioned earlier, who's responsible for safety in that company, and say, this is our observation, or this is our finding, what do you think? And then we'll find out if they agree or not. And when they don't, if there's no agreement, then we would say, well, this is the reasons why we've made this, and try to get an understanding of what the risks are. And we've found that that's been really useful. And we've had the seriousness that these accountable managers take that discussion has been fantastic. Because it's sometimes things that they don't know. Because they have an escalation path and a hierarchy within their company, and they don't see maybe what we see. So once we've understood what the risks are, we then make some decisions about when we are looking at the regulations that that company has to comply with and their risk, we can say, okay, that risk, so we all look in this bunch of regulations to confirm that they are following the regulations for that particular area. So we can use it on a kind of more sample-based way or approach based on that particular risk that they may have. Then basically it would then drive the plan for the next year of all the visits that they get and the things that we would want to look at and the action plan that they've got in place. And then we do that on a regular basis, maybe annually, maybe two. But what we would do is within the rules we have the ability to flex the frequency of those visits. So we would maybe if we were more worried about one company or it was a very complex company, we may go and visit more. If it's less complex and we have no worries, then we may go less. And of course, all of that learning from that year feeds back into the system to see if there's any new insights there. And things like a company as a new safety director, and that creates a different safety culture within that company. That can make a big difference. So we would be detecting that and highlighting if there's any deficiencies there. Okay. So I mentioned kind of, this is our total system risk picture here. So when a company has an approval with us, or we have oversight of that company, if they're doing maintenance or design, then we have more control and influence over those individuals. But if it's, for example, a UK airline's going overseas and there's an airport overseas, we don't have any control of that. But we want to know if there's any safety issues there, because we are absolutely focused on the consumer of aviation and the third party associated with that. So we would be interested in trying to influence that airport if we felt that there was a safety risk there. Similarly, if we've got foreign airlines coming into the UK and there are safety issues with that, we would want to influence them as well. So we would want to go back to whoever is doing similar to us, the aviation oversight, and be discussing with them about how they could influence that. And we've found that that approach has been quite effective, and we've seen a few examples. We have, in that foreign airlines, we had a number of years ago now, some level bus, and level bus are where they're outside of the level that they're directed to be at. And it was one particular airline that was having a number of these, so we went back to that country, gave them the data, then we had a joint meeting with that airline as well, and you could see over the number of years that number going down. We call that influencing outside of our control. So even though it's not in our remit necessarily, because we're focused on the UK consumer, it drives us into that area. This is quite a hot topic for us at the moment. So you've probably heard about big data and big data programs. So we have one of those. We have of this 30,000 accident reports every year, and you can imagine how many years we've been doing this. That's a lot of data, and we want to get full access to that data. So we want to be able to interrogate it. We want to look for trends before they turn into a more serious incident. So we're looking to technology to help us do this. So we've got a program that kind of is pulling together all the data sources that we have, and we're going to be looking at machine learning, artificial intelligence to help us find any potential issues in there. So that's quite an exciting program. That's been going now for over 7 months, and we see the first kind of drop of that towards the end of the year. Also, the leadership role. We've realised from the work we've done on safety culture, actually, that the individuals within the company can be absolute role models in safety culture. So we want to recognise that, understand, even within our own people, what good looks like, and try to drive behaviours associated with what good looks like. So we're doing a bit of work. We're using a thing called a safety maturity model, and what we've created there, I think, it's not groundbreaking. Safety maturity models have been around for a while, but what was groundbreaking, I think, is we got an external company to look at all the best safety maturity models across the industry, not just the aviation industry, but the nuclear industry, the rail industry, and we've created from their bits and pieces one of our own that's the best of the best. So that's quite groundbreaking. We'd like to kind of think that's state of the art. We're now doing, scoring ourselves against that model. We've also taken that model to Europe and said, hey, do you guys want to use this? And they do. They want to change it a little bit, but it's great that they want to use it, and they are now working out what that looks like for them. And then later on in the, once we've done our baselining, we'll be looking to find out where the areas where we can improve and trying to benchmark that with other industries. One of the absolute keys, though, is the focus on learning. And what do I mean by that? Well, Grenville was a good example of that. It's not a natural thing for the CAA to start an investigation on Grenville. I remember somebody saying to me, what the devil are you doing that for? That seems a bit of a waste of time. But actually, if you treat every incident as a learning exercise that you can gain something from, wow, you can learn a lot from it. So we're starting to not only when something goes wrong, share that learning in our own team, but share it wider as well. Which brings me back to Grenville. So our own investigation highlighted a number of issues which were, I'm glad to say, reflected by the Dame Judith Hackett investigation, where she looked into it. I've not used some of the kind of strong words she used in her report, but it's a very interesting read if you haven't read it on the internet, and you can have a read of it. And quite a highlighting some of the things that she found. So in terms of building regulations, complexity of regulations, and the guidance. So if I describe one of those items, there's some great guidance about cladding and about how cladding can turn into a chimney if you don't block it at certain levels. And it can accelerate it, and it can make it, and it can, and if the material is combustible, it can make it accelerate that intensity and the heat. And I think that's what we saw in Grenville. Obviously, the inquiry is still ongoing. But what it did, it made us think, okay, so what is the parallel in aviation to some of these things that that were found? So we did a bit of a review, and we said to ourselves, right, regulations. Are there any suboptimal regulations that we know about in the aviation industry? What about accountability? So one of the areas was who was actually accountable for that building, and did they have a safety management in place? So what would be the equivalent? So the equivalent on our side would be the accountable manager that I mentioned earlier. And what's great news is the government have been coming to talk to us about accountable manager. They've also been talking to us about the reporting methodologies that we've got in place, which is great news. Something else that we did, there was, I don't know if many of you remember, but it was a terrible tragedy in Manchester. It was a British Air Tours aircraft where an engine caught fire, and the pilot didn't know it was an engine failure to start with, and turned it to get off the runway, and that actually then went into the wind, and the wind blew effectively and caught the cabin was caught on fire. I think it's 55 people died in that, and as a result of that, it made us, at that time, that was in 1985, look at all of the design of aircraft. And one of the suggestions was about smoke hoods and whether smoke hoods should be available on an aircraft, a bit like the drop-down air ventilators that they have. And we did a kind of a balanced equation here that said we want passengers to get off that aircraft as soon as possible. Would donning smoke hood actually make that worse so that they're actually on the aircraft longer? And are they trained to use it? Would it be effective? And our balance of a view on that was that actually we want to put our effort into making the inside of the cabin more fire resistant and smoke resistant and better escape rather than smoke hoods. So we said, was that the right decision? So we re-looked at it again. We had some people that were around during that time. We asked them to re-look at it and re-look at their judgment on this. And we also, because in between time, the responsibility for the design of the aircraft had moved over to EASA, which is the European Safety Agency. So we asked them to have a look at it as well. We said, can you do an independent review on that? And actually, both parties said, yes, we think we made the right decision. But it made us think about it. We weren't resting on our laurels. It could have been a different outcome there, but we decided that was the right outcome. And actually the improvements that have been made in aircraft for the fire resistant, the lights to get out, the improved access off the aircraft are exactly the action we should be taking, as opposed to encouraging people to stay in their seats with smoke hoods on. So, as a result of that, we learnt a lot of lessons. There are still some actions we are taking associated with this, but it's given us a thirst for this kind of thing that says every incident like this is an opportunity for us to learn, and that's absolutely key. And you've got to be in the mode of learning for this to work. So, my conclusion out of all those slides is all safety improvements require a learning culture. When you're on that learning culture, your journey never ends. You've got to be continuously looking for the next thing to learn. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I think they want to get you a microphone so that everybody else can hear. 1 second.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned 0 fatalities in UK in a year as typical, but how does that compare with the global scene? How does the fatality figures compare with the global scene? And what impact do you have with the rest of the aviation scene? Because we all make the same, but potentially make the same mistakes.
Yeah. So we have a number of avenues that we can get additional information when an accident happens elsewhere. So we can either get that information from the National Aviation Authority of that country, and also the investigation team. That eventually they normally publish those records and we can learn from those. So there's normally some delay to that, finding out that information, but we can find that information out. There's also like global investigation forums where they exchange information about the lesson learning that they have. So there's a number of areas, and within the European area, we share all of our incidents and reporting that I mentioned earlier. So
if you read Flight Magazine, there are incidents all around the world, frequently.
Yeah. the key thing is to get that information, the data, and try to learn from that, coming back to my learning, and then to take some action on that.
I mean, what's interesting, I went to look at Juliet Lima, the company, and a couple of things which I discovered which were not pursued, but should have been, but I obviously have reported them. Things which, one was a repair of a repair, which shouldn't happen on the engine that failed, and the other was the front right door wouldn't open properly, both of which caused fatalities.
So the key thing for me is that kind of thing is reported, and a company internally would encourage
the mistake
that.
was the pilot turned off the runway. That's what he should not have done. We know now that he should have stayed head up the runway.
Yeah. No, I agree.
But how you quote these wonderful figures for Britain. I'm sure that the whole world of aviation is nothing like this safe.
We do look at quite frequently, because we do have figures about safety and accidents and numbers of fatalities in different countries, and you're right, they're not all the same. There are different countries, but it's not under our jurisdiction. All they can do, and they have the same information available to them, which kind of generally prompts people to come to us to find out what we're doing, to get that kind of figure, which is something we should be proud of.
Good evening. David Maudsley, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. It was superb. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much enjoyed it. If I could just sort of zero in a bit more on the future. I was struck by the program that you mentioned concerning big data programs, and the fact that you are sort of doing this in the Regulatory Authority. And I think you touched on the fact that you were also trying to do more with Europe in this regard. But could I just ask, as I'm involved in this area to this day, could I just ask really whether that program is involving the other stakeholders, I mean the industry stakeholders like Rolls-Royce, IATA, the Flight Safety Foundation? Are you moving forward with them? Because what we don't want, of course, is the regulators choosing their way and their roadmap without industry, and then it being rather imposed on industry. And so my question is, are you involving those other important stakeholders as we move forward to be more predictive?
Very good. I think there's two levels of answer to that. The first one is the CAA's data program, where as part of that program, we're working with different sectors to only if they are willing, and they all have been, which is great. We've been working with them saying, well, what data do you have? And we know that they have lots and lots of data. I mean, every time a plane lands, their flight management system downloads into their computer. They have, terabytes of data each landing. And we don't need all of that data. What we're kind of after is, well, where are the safety issues of that? So we want them to have worked that data, and we want the analysis out of that data that's saying, here we think there are some trends, or here's some thresholds that we're worried about. So that's the kind of thing we're interested in, because, I mean, we don't want a big system that just captures every aircraft's data information. So we're working with a sample of different sectors to say those questions. How do you determine your risk? What data are you using? Which ones are kind of hovering underneath the threshold? And how could we use that? How could we get that into and import that into our system? So we're working with an engine manufacturer, an airline, and a air traffic control provider to understand what data they've got and how we might be.
I'm sorry, would that be Rolls-Royce by any chance?
It might be. Might be. Yeah. The other thing that is happening at the EASA level, there is a program called Data for Safety, where they are interested in all the data from an aircraft, and they are looking to emulate a program that the Americans are doing, which is similar, and actually getting all the downloaded data. So there is a kind of a big picture one where they can take that data and analyse it themselves. That's big bucks. And will take a bit longer to achieve.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I'll come back to you.
Hello, Tony G. I've kicked around the aviation industry as an amateur for half a century and have acquired 4,500 hours GA flying, most of it unpaid. Inevitably, I've come across this question when trying to get life insurance, which is for mortgages usually. Do you intend ever to fly in a non-fare paying aircraft? And of course, I have to say yes. Inevitably, this has required looking at the statistics. And this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, because it turned out that the most lethal form of transport was the 19th century carrier's cart, which went at 3 miles an hour because Dobbin would kick over the traces occasionally and kill a passenger or two. We've got to be slightly careful about passenger miles. The other one was, at the time when I looked at it first, there were about 1 in 3,000 fatalities per annum, and that compared with driving. Now, nowadays, recently, I heard from, I don't know, they change so often, the minister say, and it's now over the rate is now less than 1 in 6,000, saying this is slaughter. We must reduce it. Do you have any observations on, if you like, the jelly-like nature of statistics that we're having to deal with?
Well, all I can say is the kind of figures we have a group of analysts, and the figures that we produce and we publish every year are not tainted in any way. They are purely the numbers that are created, and they're visible and transparent to everybody. But the real key to what you publish is to make that understandable, and that's kind of where maybe things can go a bit awry, where you make some conclusions that a statistician might say, oh well, there's some assumptions associated with that. I continuously have discussions with our department that creates all of this data, because they want kind of pages and pages of assumptions that go after it, and actually I just want the meat of it, of what is this telling me and what should we do about it. So I get that statistics can be taken in various different ways. All I can say is the ones that we use, there is no point in us saying anything but what it's telling us.
Thank you very much for your interesting lecture. I really wanted to know how the CA is looking ahead. If I look at face value from one of your slides, it would appear that you set up teams to go in, and where you see there are risks or potential risks, put your teams into interface with the operators or the maintenance organizations or whatever. But that seems to be not like it was done in the past, when there were individual flight operations inspectors and surveyors assigned to companies who provided a two-way link. They could keep an eye on what was going on, but moreover, they were in position to advise industry as appropriate on any questions that might arise and any plans that the authority might have, for example, introducing new equipments. Is there still an effort being made to provide individual links, such as I've described?
Absolutely. So if I hadn't, it sounds like I didn't describe it properly. So what we have is individual inspectors assigned to companies. Okay? But what you might have is that company has a number of different approvals. It could be doing maintenance, it could have pilots, it could be running an operation. So you get the different speciality inspectors that are overseeing that element of it. So what I was trying to describe is that those guys are coming together and talking about that particular company and describing what they're seeing. Because I think what we found was that one inspector might have I'm not feeling very happy about that, but because he hadn't got any data on that, he may not act on that. Whereas if a number of people were seeing the same thing, that would add a little bit more, and they may have some data on it that we could present to the accountable manager. So it's kind of more, there's a bigger benefit in getting that bigger picture about the company rather than just that individual conversation with that individual. So absolutely, with the exception of regulatory capture, that's my kind of proviso on that, where as with everything, you get relationships forming between companies, and what we don't want is that there is any capture. So on a regular basis, and when I say regular, it might be 3 to 5 years, something like that, we might change the inspector. Now that might feel, well, to the individual, who spent a long time forming a great relationship and understanding, but what that does, it protects us as an authority to make sure that we are truly independent continuously and we are preventing any capture. Okay.
Can I just follow up on the gentleman's question? One of your slides. Okay. One of your slides there, it was actually slide number 20. How about that? I was listening. My colleague and I couldn't understand it, and can you call that slide up again?
Of course.
Can you run it back?
Number 20.
There you go. Yep, that's the one. No, maybe back a bit further.
Back a bit further.
Yeah. Oh, here we are. We might as well go back right to the beginning.
This one?
Basically, one of your slides there said that the regulation seemed to be reduced because of the improved sort of standard of the airlines. You weren't. There is a slide there.
Number 20.
I thought was it that one?
Yeah.
I think, were you talking about this one?
No, back again.
Back.
Back from there. All right, number 20. Okay. Yeah, that's right. I was looking at reading.
That's
relaxing of regulations. This is the one. You've got that relaxing of regulations. That's the red graph there. Okay. Can you explain what that means? Because it seems to me to follow on with what that gentleman was saying. The follow-on slide there.
I think that is trying to describe the opposite from protectionism. So having different rules in different countries, this is about getting commonality across the different harmonisation. Yeah. This is not my words, this is IATA's wording, but that's what I think they're describing there.
Yeah, I mean, are we not saying, have I got this wrong, is that graph rising upwards for an increase of relaxing of regulations or what? Are we increasing the relaxation of regulations, looking at that red line?
No, okay. So the way I read this is that aviation traffic globally can increase. Some of that is held back by having protectionism in place. Mm-hmm. The more harmonisation we have, the more that it will grow. I think that's what they're trying to say. But I would have to consult IATA to confirm that.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
You okay with that? No? Good.
I mean, basically, what I've taken from this slide is, whatever the case, it is going up. And it's, even the green line there goes up to 5 billion passengers compared with 9 billion, it looks like, compared with 3.5 now. So it's going to be at least double in the next.
That's where I was
20
looking
years.
at that further slide that gentleman was talking about, where it did seem that you had relaxer regulations.
Yeah,
So
there is no
I would never say
relaxation
that, he says,
of regulations,
because I'm in charge.
not from a UK perspective.
These regulations being relaxed aren't safety regulations, it's commercial regulations. So if the state said anyone can fly domestically even if they're not a US carrier, that would be an example of the relaxation that would drive more traffic. So that red and green isn't to do with a safety protectionism or regulation, it's to do with a commercial environment, I think.
Good explanation. Should have come to you first, shouldn't I?
Troy, Simon Brailsford, thank you for a very insightful view of the regulator now and in the future. I think we're all really very proud of being part of an industry that's at the leading edge of safety initiative. And mine's not really a question so much as a plea, is that I've moved into a different industrial sector, and all of the industrial sectors have a real craving for this information. And it's events like this that show up just where we are as an aviation community. My plea is really to add into one of your bullet points about the sharing of the initiatives, which I know you do very quietly, but actually we're all very grateful for that. And please could you keep that open dialogue with all of the different industries who are looking to aviation for this sort of initiative. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. If we hadn't done an investigation ourselves on Grenville, word spread, and we were invited to go to the Building Federation annual conference to do a bit of a presentation on what makes us safe. And we did that, and as a result of that, I think we got the government kind of heard about this and then came and talked to us separately about that as part of the Dame Judith Hackett review. So it's kind of, it's interesting, just by us initiating something like that, it's maybe created some best practice that we've shared across industries there. And I'm totally supporting that type of activity. One industry can learn from another, which is kind of where we're going on the safety maturity model. So we will be going to the nuclear industry and the rail industry because they will have stuff that we can learn from them.
Hello.
Hello.
With so many more pilots around now than ever before, is there any evidence that the level of IQ or intelligence of pilots has decreased slightly, or their competence for that matter? And is there any research done into trying to keep pilots alert and awake, or indeed in longer term to eventually do away with pilots and make the planes pilotless?
There's a few things in there, I think. I think I wouldn't be able to answer your first one about the intellectual level, or I think we are requiring a certain level of examination and testing and training, and if they pass that, then it's acceptable for them to enter in the system. As a result of German wings, for example, there has been some increased thinking about methods of supporting pilots in different ways to maybe prevent something like that in the future. But they are in progress at the moment, and we're just working out what that could be. But having a pilot support network where they can feel comfortable talking to each other, and that highlights some problems that they can then get help with, might be really beneficial. I think in terms of automation, I think increased automation means that pilots are doing less. I think that does create concerns. We need the pilots to remain alert and to be ready to act when they need to. That's a key thing, and that's, for us, the key thing is the currency training and the retraining to make sure that when needed in an emergency, they react and do the right thing, because they've seen it, done it before on simulators as opposed to the aircraft. So that's quite important that they're able to do that, even if they're not doing that on a daily basis.
There aren't any more questions. I hope no one minds if I've wind it up. Okay, go on, go for it. Take another, last one. How much monitoring of public aviation forums do you do? Because there seems to be a vast number of contributors from all sorts of cultures all around the world who put their 2 pennies worth in many events.
Can you give me an example of what you're referring to there?
Well, if there's any aircraft incidents or accidents, then people come on and say, well, the switches were
Okay.
there, or
Yeah.
we should have done this, or the
Yeah.
FCC wasn't good.
Well, maybe I can give you an example of, so in America last year, Southwest incident where a window came off and a passenger was pulled through the window. Obviously very alarming. So the first thing we did was we did a trawl of all of our data that I've described earlier and did analysis to say, are there any similar type incidents, issues that could have ended in the same way? And that kind of prompted then a whole series of questions to particular airlines. There was that aircraft type, and how many have we got in the UK, and how many use that, what's that airline doing about that, etc. So it did prompt a whole load of actions from our part to make sure that we haven't got the same problem. I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but it's about reacting when something serious happens elsewhere, understanding how is that relevant to us? Do we use that aircraft, etc., so that we can take the appropriate action?
Can I just have one more question? Very brief. I hope you can hear the site. Try and pitch my voice, but thank you. I'm noting what you say about maturity levels and your interest in the various maturity levels of performance-based regulation around the world. If the maturity level is based on a red, amber, green sort of triangle, if you like, where would the British Civil Aviation Authority be with the implementation of performance-based regulation?
Mm-hmm. Where would we place ourselves in that complexity triangle? Interesting. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this a number of years now, 5 years we've been on this. And I would, as with any large change program, you've got the people, the training of those people, you've got the systems that they're using and the processes. So we have developed all of that, and we have seen it being used. And the managers now have data to show that that is being used. I think the key thing that we should never lose sight of is this is all implemented by humans, and humans have their own objections to things. So sometimes it's a bit like the way I describe this internally. If you think about car safety, And you see a similar graph to car safety. You know, back in my dad's day where he refused to wear seatbelts, for example. But that has come way down, and it's only over time that you get societal acceptance or company acceptance of something like that. So we're on that path. And whereas nowadays you wouldn't think about not wearing a seatbelt, you'd be challenging passengers to wear their seatbelt, you would not get in a car drunk, etc., etc. Some of those things used to happen, and now they don't, and that's all driven by law, increased awareness, and time, actually. So I would say that we're in the same path, that a big culture change like that doesn't happen overnight. We're 5 years into that. We're not giving up. We're continuously learning from that. The feedback we're getting from industry is really good. We have an industry group that we pull together that help us oversee the implementation of this, and the feedback is great. So thank you for your assessment of us being in the green. That's welcome.
Can we make this the last one, please?
Right, last question. Mine's a general one, and that is, with Brexit looming on the horizon, do you have any view you can share with us on the relationship in the future between the CAA and EASA?
So our relationship with the EASA is really good, and they value our input, and we value the input they can give us. There is no question of that. And our position is similar to the Department for Transport in that we would both like an outcome where we remain in EASA, independent of the bigger outcome. So that would be our aim. We would like that and support that. Whether we get our wish is another question.
Last one. Okay. A quick thing, really. We're losing a lot of heritage in this country now, and a lot of aeroplanes are going over to the States, ex-military aircraft and some civilian ones. Do you think that the CAA will ever start to look at relaxing the controls they have on civil aircraft that are in private hands? So, for instance, VC-10s at Bruntingthorpe that can do fast taxi runs, they're capable of flying, and with the right controls, do you think that things like that may fly again?
Wow.
And the F6 Lightnings, they're capable as well. And the Buccaneers.
I'm not sure I could give a great answer to that one. Our responsibility is to make sure that we've got safe, that both the consumer and third parties, which is key, remain safe. So we would be applying that criteria to any thoughts of people applying for certification of those type of aircraft. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much for...
From across the globe, from the centre of aerospace. And now to you.
Thank you for downloading from the Royal Aeronautical Society. If you enjoyed this content, please consider showing your support for the Society. Share a link to this presentation by email or on your favourite social networks. If you have an interest in aerospace, consider the professional and personal benefits of membership. Visit www.aerosociety.com.